meal distribution, I think, is a confusing issue. I think the most important meal of the day to correct is breakfast. So I think that just adding a lot more protein to a big dinner meal, I think, is pretty useless to do. And there have been experiments. Some of the Australian group sort of did that type of thing and didn't see much effect. I think the issue is when you come out of the overnight fast, the body's very sensitive to protein. It's also kind of sensitive to carbohydrate. So if you want to buy the insulin regulation theory, the worst of all worlds would be to have a high carbohydrate breakfast. So breakfast cereal with a banana and a glass of orange juice is probably a pre-diabetic diet. If I was going to create diets that cause diabetes, that's how I'd start the day.
No one is coming to your house for breakfast.
I know.
Fascinating. Truly, truly interesting. Let me circle back and let me ask this question in a different way. When you have that first meal, and really what I'm getting at is this thermic effect of feeding, or why or potentially how we could distribute protein that would increase thermogenesis. And again, I'm saying this loosely. Would we see an additive effect if we hit enough protein between 30 and minimum of 30 grams to trigger the mechanics of skeletal muscle? Would we see an increase in the thermogenic effect? Because in the literature, you will see this thermic effect of feeding variable. It might be some data you might see 20%, some data you might see upwards of 25 to even 30. And there are variations within the literature. And I would love for you to highlight, as people are thinking, how can they leverage the food that they're ingesting and create a way of eating that provides even more utilization of calories, if at all?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, as you know, I always think in terms of mechanisms. If
Yes,
if
he
I'm
does.
going to discuss something, I'm going to underpin it with a mechanism. And so the answer to your question is, what do you think the mechanism is? If you think it is something to do with digestion, absorption, and handling of nitrogen, then it doesn't matter when you digest the protein. However, if I'm right, and it has to do with triggering muscle protein synthesis, then moving protein to the first meal is critical. And I think that's the variation in the literature. If you see some of the diets that have been used, they're not paying attention to meal distribution. And I think if you group all of the protein in the last meal of the day, you'll minimize the thermogenic effect. And so maybe you'll only observe 10% maximum, where if you begin to distribute it differently, especially to the first meal, I think you can make it 20%. So, we've done some research that shows the ATP expenditure of that first meal, and I'm convinced that's the thermic effect. It's not digestion, absorption, and nitrogen metabolism, it's protein synthesis and muscle.
Which is a very important point. It's a very important point. And you guys, this is just to highlight that there is variations in the literature. Now, I want to make sure that we talk about, there's something else that you had mentioned that I'd love for you to elaborate on. And you said that a high-fat diet would also cause insulin resistance. How?
And so you can go into the literature and you can see both human and animal models where people have fed high fat diets, really high fat diets, 40, 50, 60% fat, and they can show insulin resistance. But you always have to start your thinking about it as, is this a excess calorie diet? So is the body in a net storage issue? A 60% fat diet, a ketogenic type fat diet where people are eating less than their calorie balance probably won't have any negative effects. But if you're overeating calories, then whether you're eating carbs or fat, both of them are going to get you into trouble. And so you can see studies where they fed high fat and you'll get increased blood levels of triglycerides, increased free fatty acids. You'll get increased things like ceramides and diacylglycerides, which will inhibit insulin sensitivity. There's no question that can happen. But you can do exactly the same thing overeating carbohydrates. And so, back to my earlier point, what are people overeating the most? Well, 50% is coming from carbohydrates and 35 is coming from fat. Is it the bigger number or the littler number? I think both are important. And as you know, I don't go out and try and create high fat diets, but I don't think there's anything wrong with a 35% fat diet or even up to a 40% fat diet as long as the calories are in check.
I would absolutely agree with you. And this brings me to something that I do want to bring up because I've had a lot of people send me this study, and this is a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And researchers looked at health data from 200,000 people from the Nurses Health Study, the Health Study 2, and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study in the US. And what they found was that those who ate the most red meat had a 62% higher risk of developing the condition compared with those who ate the least. And I think that the condition that they were talking about was type 2 diabetes. And in light of everything that we are talking about, it seems a bit counterintuitive that the idea of swapping out any kind of carbohydrate for some high quality protein would actually thus lead to a type 2 diabetes risks. I will say that this first came across my desk because it was published in The Guardian. Do you have any comments of this Harvard University study?
Do you want me to trash
By the way,
Guardian?
I have to say, you have to understand, I know these answers and what he is about to say, but it's important that you hear it because, again, the goal of this podcast is to have transparent conversations. And if we cannot have transparent conversations with world experts in a meaningful way, then what are we doing? And I'm going to kick the ball over to you, my friend.
Yeah. So, it's a Harvard study, and they have published this multiple times. It's from the Nurses Study, which I think people need to understand is it's an interesting group that they have followed for a lot of years. But what's important to understand is it's a proprietary data set that nobody else can look at. So they basically can dream up answers and manipulate the data any way they want and publish results. And they've published this before. There's other groups that have looked at the same kind of data with the NHANES data, public data, and what they've actually shown is that red meat reduces the risk of diabetes. And so, you have to sort of look at it. And the first thing that you and I've said before, and most people listening probably have heard, is that epidemiology proves nothing. Basically, it says, okay, here's something to look at. And so, one of the things to realize is that if you do, when you start looking at red meat, you have to think about, are you looking at people who have a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet? So if I take somebody who's overeating calories and I have them put a sausage pizza per day on top of an unhealthy diet, I guarantee you it's going to get more unhealthy. So was it the sausage in the pizza or was it the 1,200 calories from the cheese and the bread? I mean, it's an association issue and you have to look at it. The studies that you and I were talking about, the 3 clinical studies that we did, and one of which was 12 months long with 130 subjects, these are random controlled trials. These are trials where we actually know what they're eating. We're monitoring it week by week, day by day. These aren't just sort of retrospective. I asked the nurse what she ate yesterday. These are controlled trials. And what's important about it is when we added in the protein, that 50 grams, we did it primarily with red meat. So substituting red meat into lower carbohydrates always, always improved pre-diabetic conditions and glycemic regulation. So if you look at that in the literature and actually controlled studies, what you see is it's always beneficial. So when the epidemiology and the pure science, the random controlled trials don't agree, then you have to start asking why. And the why is because because the epidemiology is making vague associations that are hidden behind lifestyle, how much fiber they eat, how many calories they eat, and they're not factoring it out. So again, you really have to look at those things. And when they continue to publish the same thing without ever doing random control trials to back it up, then you have to start looking for agendas. And I think most people would recognize, well, Willett has an agenda-driven individual. He's the author of the Eat Lancet that basically said you should eat more sugar than protein. I think there's some highly questionable science behind his thinking.